Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Akshita Puram and I am a product marketing manager at SmartBear. All right, well, for those of you who are new to SmartBear, SmartBear is a leading provider for software quality tools for teams over 22,000 organizations around the world. Today, we are kicking off a 3-part series called Complete Continuous Testing Guide How-To Series presented by us. I am super excited for this series and kicking it off today with part 1, mainly because we talk to many of our customers, many of people who are interested in entering test automation, and what we have really uncovered is that QA teams are rethinking their testing processes and tooling in order to move forward toward a faster, more reliable, and higher quality software development and delivery. The key to accomplishing this that we have noticed is by embracing a continuous future. Continuous testing is the foundation of a continuous delivery engine that has not only changed the way teams structure their workflows and systems, but also has led to somewhat of a mindset shift for development, testing, and operations teams. So today's session, as I mentioned, is part 1 of the SmartBear Complete Continuous Testing story. In part 1, in today's webinar, we will learn what continuous testing is, why it's important, and how we can incorporate stakeholders throughout the development cycle, including business analysts, developers, and QA engineers. Teams can then optimize benefits of a continuous engine by designing a continuous testing strategy that is really in lockstep with their development strategy. In the rest of the 3-part series, we will discuss common challenges and how to build a framework to set up continuous testing in your organization, and that's mainly going to be in part 2. And in part 3, we will discuss how to optimize your approach with continuous integration. Today, I have with me, with us, Param Chopra. Param, how are you today?
I'm great. I'm actually pretty warm here. It's only 32 degrees outside Fahrenheit in Boston, so it's a pretty nice warm day for us on the East Coast.
Nice, nice. I guess it's all relative, right, Param?
Of course.
Well, fantastic. Later on in this webinar, Param will actually be demoing 2 products that together provide a continuous testing platform for, number 1, all the members in the software development cycle, and 2, for those really practicing behavior-driven development. And really anyone can do that, and that's what we want to kind of advocate for today. So before we get started, we have a quick poll for you to learn more about the technologies you are using and testing. So I'm going to go ahead and start that poll, and you'll see it pop up on your screen. All right, wonderful. We always like to get a good majority of people responding, so please go ahead and take the time to click that button that's on the screen and let me know what type of operating system you use today to run your tests on. It is multiple choice because I know there's always sometimes multiple systems and multiple applications that everyone is testing, but it looks like the majority we have here is Windows. A little bit of Mac, a little bit of Linux, a little bit of mobile devices, but I'll share these results with you right now. It looks like that majority is really Windows at 87%. Always interesting to see. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And I think a good place to get started is to really talk about the differences between continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment. Continuous testing is often tied to these 3 elements. These common terms that we see more and more often occur in thought leadership, in more of these types of webinars, and more by just tool providers in general. While the terms are used somewhat interchangeably at times, they're just ever so slightly different. And there are some key differences between all of them, and especially these 3 right here on the page. And I want to go ahead and kind of talk about those differences and answer any questions that people may have about them. But the first and foremost, continuous integration, does not at all deal with delivering the application to production. It only deals with getting that new code that you have into the master branch of a repository more frequently. So to have this occur more often, code needs to be built into really smaller pieces, which then allows teams to detect issues earlier. When those bite-sized pieces of codes gets pushed, the application or service is then packaged up, it's built, it's tested, as many of you are familiar with, and then it's deployed on a test server, or a server in general. And when this is in place, your entire testing suite should run when code is integrated, from unit test to API test to UI test. Moving on to the next one, continuous delivery. That is really the first level of actually getting the product onto the hands of the users. But the actual act of deploying the branch to production is still a manual exercise, or there's some sort of type of manual check, as you can see from the gray arrows at the end of the continuous delivery chain. So all of it from start to integrate to right before releasing into production is automated in a continuous delivery cycle, and then that last piece is ends up being a little bit has a manual touch. Continuous deployment is the combination of the two, combination of continuous integration and testing and deploying to production, all really in an automated fashion. So as soon as you write the code in your terminal, you do a git commit, and you leave a nice detailed message, Jenkins then starts the entire process to get that build out there. If all the tests pass, the new master branch replaces the current one in production, and with automation in place, there's really no human interaction that needs to take place after the code itself is written. So for all of this to occur, it sounds all nice and dandy, but as practitioners, as many of you are on the phone, that, not everything is always as smooth as can be. But this continuous process is absolutely perfect for an agile methodology, and it almost requires folks to be agile in a sense. An agile approach really calls for rapid iteration and getting that feedback often, which is why, it's helpful in not necessarily a smooth environment, because it does enable that iteration to take place. And that can be complemented by a strong CI/CD pipeline with sufficient automated test coverage.
And just if I could say a quick point here, Akshita, the whole idea of automating as much as possible isn't just to speed up some of your manual testing workflows or be more efficient in terms of how much time you're testing, but it's also to get more feedback, right? Not only are you getting feedback earlier by iterating more often, but the idea is that if you automate more of your test cases, you can get a much larger set of feedback much more quickly, right? You can make a much larger set of decisions much more quickly. So automating as possible isn't just about speeding up for the sake of it, but it's also just to get more feedback in itself, which, really just enables the whole process.
Absolutely. And I think that's what this webinar is really about. Like what are the tools, what are the capabilities out there? What are those how-tos to increase the amount of feedback, to be able to act on that feedback? What are the capabilities that people are using in the market today to kind of create that environment for continuous learning, which is really based and focused on providing more feedback, in whether it's earlier, and also increasing the amount of feedback to receive to enable that continuous learning. All right, so we've talked about, when we talk about continuous integration, and that's automation and this aspect of continuous testing, we realize that, it sounds all really nice. It sounds fast, it sounds continuous, it sounds great. But what we really haven't talked about is as much as that continuous testing piece and test automation. And at the end of the day, testing can sometimes be a source of time suck in many organizations. And you'll see that, sometimes when we are doing so much of it, and it's because it's in the middle of it's in between the build and the deployment, it becomes, many eyes are on those that are doing the testing. And so we are trying to always kind of automate our tests as much as possible at multiple layers of our application for that maximum speed, for that maximum coverage. So continuous testing really ends up being the foundation of delivering continuous integration, delivery, and deployment that allows you to really reap many, many benefits. So as that foundation, it really is the output of many things. So for us, for many people to reap the benefits of automation, it really allows some time savings, and that really gets bucketed into three different areas. One is just you are allowed to have better time spent for business requirement alignment. So it frees up time kind of doing the repetitive manual tasks that you may be working on and focusing on, hey, ensuring that your application matches the user requirements for that alignment to occur. Second, it allows for truly an increase in test coverage. At the end of the day, there will always be these finite amount of time to test a product. Time is always squeezed in the testing phase, and you may not always be able to test all aspects. But with automation and teams mainly focusing on what are those high risk areas to test, you can at least optimize test coverage. Lastly, we're getting instant feedback in our deployment cycle. We've talked about how this can happen with iteration, with feedback in general, but at the end of the day, we do want to have that feedback so that we can have faster time to resolution. You can spend all morning on a new feature, and then within 5 minutes of checking that new code, you can have instant feedback across multiple layers, and that can be accomplished with automation. So even though there are many benefits from automation that you have heard about, you've read about, you've been on other webinars that have advocated for it as well, it's not just about automation. That is one piece of the story. It is the foundation, but that is still one element. What really needs to happen is that there needs to be collaboration and instant feedback for continuous learning to occur and continuous testing to be successful. So today, quality really should be everyone's job. On the SDLC phases you see on the left, you'll see that all participants should play a role in ensuring quality. You'll see whether that's in the plan phase, the design phase, the build phase, the deployment phase, or kind of the management phase after the fact. And there are really, if we were to take a look in a broad sense, there's three stakeholders that we want to really create that collaboration between. There's the business stakeholder, the developer, and then there's the tester. And we want to increase that collaboration throughout the SDLC for all three of those players. So the process has modernized, and there are different users, and you need different tools to fit the capabilities of each of these users. But at the end of the day, you want to create that perfect cross-section for all three of these stakeholders. Because where that perfect cross-section is and where that perfect cross-section meets, that's what really needs to be done to meet the need. And that's the feature and the application requirement that you should be testing. And so modern teams working in agile, continuous environments are finding ways, more and more ways, to find that perfect cross-section between these different stakeholders. And one aspect of that is really collaboration with behavior-driven development. So in one tweet, behavior-driven development is using examples at multiple levels to create a shared understanding and surface uncertainty to deliver software that matters. So that shared understanding between those three layers is what can be accomplished with behavior-driven development. I do want to note that if you do have any questions as I'm going through this presentation and prior to the demo, feel free to let me know feel free to leverage the Q&A. And if you have any comments, etc., feel free to use the chat. But the Q&A allows us to kind of monitor accordingly. I do see some hellos. Hello, everyone from around the world. But to kind of go back to the collaboration with BDD, some of the other benefits is using these examples to drive development and living documentation when automated. So I want to, before we dive into the demo and learning about how this can be accomplished throughout the SDLC and creating that shared understanding, I do want to get a poll out there to understand and gauge, does your team practice or want to adopt behavior-driven development? All right, so we have a poll up, let me know. Love to kind of see the interest. To answer some of the questions in the interim while people are populating the poll, yes, the session will be provided and available later. A recording will be available at smartbear.com/resources/webinars. All right, that is great. So please do take some time to click on that poll that's on your screen. We want to know about what your interest level is with BDD. Does your team practice it? Are you interested in practicing it, etc.? All right, I will share these results with you. It looks like, not many people necessarily practice it or struggling with it, but there are a lot of people interested in learning about it. So I'm glad you guys are here in this webinar. And I'll share these results with you really quickly. Stop sharing results. And then I'm going to talk about how we can accomplish that end-to-end BDD workflow in the tools that we have today. So we're going to be demoing hip test, and the second tool that we'll demo is test left. If there were 3 phases in the BDD workflow, well, there are 3 phases: discovery, formulation, automation. In the discovery phase, and at the end of the day, SmartBear tools facilitate collaboration natively by reusing many of these assets throughout this flow, throughout the SDLC, to create an end-to-end BDD workflow. And what's so wonderful about these tools is that at the discovery and the formulation phase, teams can go back and forth between business and requirements and feature files to come to a shared understanding, and which is why you'll see this doubled arrow. And then the automation phase, teams can review and refactor continuously between feature files and step definitions to also iterate there. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Param to dive into that workflow so that you can see this in action. So Param, I'm going to make you presenter.
All right.
And then in the meantime, as Param starts sharing his screen, feel free to provide and ask questions throughout his demo on the Q&A site, because we want to make sure that we know that a lot of people are interested in learning more about BDD and how this can be accomplished with actual tools and making it more tangible and tactical. So feel free to ask any questions. All right, Param, off to you.
Okay, and before I do the full demo here, both products, quickly just want to get a quick poll out here. I can demo this project in either one of 2 languages, Java or C#. Let's see who wins. I think everyone's got Java as an early lead here. And I'll stop polling in just a couple seconds. Got the majority of people voting here. All right, it looks like we can stop, and looks like most of you want to see Java. That would be unsurprising if Java didn't win. So we'll show a Java example today, but just so you know that both tools will work very well with C# as well. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Quickly, Prabhu is asking, do you have VB script? Currently, TestUp does not support VB script. Neither does hip test, to answer your question. All right. So to kind of follow up on Akshita's points on actually implementing, an agile workflow, iterative workflow maybe steeped in behavior-driven development, how do we actually do this? Well, there are a lot of tools in the market you can use. I'm sure a lot of you heard of Cucumber for Java or Spectral for C#. That allows you to create those shared references, that consistent business domain language in your scenarios, let's say using Gherkin, then translating that to code, right, so you can automate. No, it sounds very nice, but a lot of times then these tools don't actually get us to the agile promised land, right? I have to spend a lot of time, editing my shared steps and my scripts, all manually, or have to spend a lot of time refactoring my code. I'm not actually going to be agile, right? I can say I'm being agile, I can say I'm automating, but if I'm literally not saving that much time in my, sprint cycles or deployments, then I'm not really benefiting from this strategy that Akshita has been trumpeting in the first part of this webinar. So how do some of these tools, hip test and test left, more easily allow our users to pursue these workflows and actually benefit from them? Let's take a look at hip test first, which is our test management and test creation tool, really aimed at helping users perform BDD or follow BDD a lot more efficiently. right? Because we certainly know that open source is not always the best way to get there. So hip test can kind of solve some of those problems. So what are some problems it solves compared to open source? Well, the first one will be the maintainability of your project. We certainly believe that in a tool like hip test, it would be much easier for you to write test cases and reuse the parts of your test cases more efficiently. Very much like writing a program. Let's go take a look. So in hip test, I can go ahead and create my test scenarios. Now, maybe it would be nice to have another poll asking about Gherkin, but that's quite all right. If you guys have never seen BDD before or never used it, a very popular language in BDD is something called gherkin. And all gherkin is these tags here: given, when, or then. Maybe an and as well, as or a but as a conjoining statement. And that's it. All gherkin, and gherkin can be written in any language. So for all of you around the world, right, if you're not, English is not your first language, you don't have to write gherkin in English. I believe it supports every language out there. And all you really need is to set up a given step, which should be your precondition for your test case. For example, this one says, given I've launched my application and I've logged in. Then the test step, which is the when, right, the action, when I add a new order for customer to the orders list. And then my then is my assertion, right, my result. Then I should see the new order pointer into the list. Pretty much every scenario, right, in Gherkin has this given, when, then formula, right? Given my precondition, when my action happens, then this is my result. And you don't have to necessarily write in Gherkin to pursue BDD workflow, but it's certainly very popular, and it is a nice way to add some, I think, logical operators to your test cases. Now, very quickly, I'm getting some quick questions here before I move on. I want to quickly address them. JavaScript is not supported with our automation tool, TestLots, but it is supported with hip test. David's asking, when you say users, does it mean a final user or tester within the development team? I'll address this in a little bit, David. And then finally, John says, are existing steps reusable and visible in hip test? We're getting to that just right now. But I do appreciate your guys' enthusiasm. Keep it up. All right. So you can write a test case like this in hip test. Now, keep this in mind, right? Keep this scenario in mind here. Let's go ahead and maybe create a new scenario where maybe I add a couple more orders. Maybe I'll add 4 orders, let's say, to my list. Maybe I want to test that scenario out. Obviously, your scenario might be more complex than this, but for the sake of example, we're going to add 4 orders. Now, recall, right, how in my other scenario, I have these 2 statements. And I'm sure you guys have statements in your test cases that will be reused across your scenarios, right? You might have to log in and launch your application at the beginning of every scenario. I'll probably have to do the same when I go ahead and add 4 orders. So let me start writing that out. But now, instead of having to write from scratch, which is so often the case in open source Gherkin, right, or tools that support Gherkin open source, like a Cucumber or SpecFlow, with hip test, I can reuse any statement, any step I've already used in my scenarios again with this nice suggestions box right here when I write my steps. It works very much like IntelliSense to me in an IDE, right? I'm sure a lot of you code. If you're typing in your IDE, right, your IDE will suggest to you what objects you might want to use or references, et cetera, et cetera. If you've defined them previously, it's the same exact idea here in hip test. Excuse me. So now all I have to do is, right, given I have launched the application, and I can simply click my statement and reuse it. Maybe I'll reuse the parameters I've defined for that statement as well. And I have logged in, right? And then maybe my when might be non-unique, right? When I add, right, I don't have 4 orders, so when I add 4 orders to the orders list, so maybe I'm writing 1 step from scratch. I'm being realistic. That's totally fine. I can create a new step there. That's reusable. Then I should, seed new orders upon return to the list. So as you can see here, out of my simple 4-step scenario, I didn't have to write 3 of those steps. It's all written for me. So I can save a whole bunch of time, especially when I'm following Akshida's point, right, of creating a shared language, a consistent business domain language to describe your test cases, the processes in these test cases, the parts of your application or test. For example, I'm calling my app orders application, I'm calling it that in all my test cases and all my steps, right? If I'm using the phrase I have logged in, I'm not saying I've signed in, right? Or I've authenticated in. I'm using the same phrasing. And the reason for doing that not is just so that multiple people in your team can understand what's happening, but it's also so that you can take these pieces and accurately reuse them over and over again. And that sounds like a nice practice, but again, open source doesn't enable that too well. Unless you're building a reusable framework from scratch or using a lot of control find, control replace, using an IDE or a notepad to kind of reuse statements, you can't really reuse them in this way, right? You have to type it out from scratch. But a tool like HipTest actually enables that element of BDD to be more successful, right? If we want to actually create these statements that are easy to reuse, we give you a platform to do so right over here. But now, to me, this isn't actually the most useful aspect of this editor. Sure, we can save some time, but I'm sure maybe you'll save half the time writing your scenarios. Maybe you're using half the steps. But to me, the bigger pain isn't writing new scenarios. It's really editing them, right? The whole point Akshita brought up earlier was getting feedback continuously. The more feedback you get in your iterative cycles, the more you can refactor your application to meet the behavior your end users expect. And so in order to do that, you need to be able to quickly refactor, right, to stay in this agile mode. If you get feedback and it takes you hours upon days to refactor all your scripts for a shared step, again, you're losing that effect of being iterative in your process. With HipTest, we don't have that problem. Not only are each of these statements, which are actually defined as action words, so FYI, each reusable statement in a scenario is called an action word in HipTest, but each of these action words are not only reusable with my IntelliSense editor over here, but then if I want to edit, let's say the URL here, right, from maybe I want to change it to a production URL from test. Instead of making several separate changes, which I normally have to do in open source, I can make one change right here where the action word lives. Or similarly, if I'm in my scenario, I could change the action word and rename it everywhere. So each of these steps, think of it like a function in code, right? You define a function or a helper function. You can call it anywhere you like. You can reuse it. And if you only have to edit it where it's been defined, right? Meaning that if it's being called 100 times, you don't have to edit it 100 times. We find that in manual testing, we don't actually have that, right? Each step is technically hard-coded. So how do we bring these nice development practices to manual testing? We'll give you an editor and a set of reusable steps that allow you to get that benefit. So now you can build out your gherkin scenarios, your manual tests with these nice reusable pieces, now getting the much greater benefit of having a single point of maintenance for each of your shared steps in HipTest as well, right? So now we can truly, I think, at least for this editor, for the first part of this demo, really work through a more agile type of workflow because we can save a lot of time when we have to refactor and during initial creation as well. Now, this is certainly nice, but what else can we do from here? Well, something quickly that we can do is also collaborate. So the second big value HipTest is providing us is the collaboration piece. We want to be able to collaborate in BDD in general, right? Or in Agile, forget even BDD. Because to me, behavior-driven development is a way to implement being Agile. Agile is a giant buzzword. How do we make it more concrete? Well, you can follow some of the tenets of behavior-driven development in order to do so. One big tenet of that philosophy is collaboration, right? And not only is it making sure that your scenarios or how you organize your scenarios is done in a way where everyone in your team can understand. And David, your question was, who's supposed to be using this tool? Really, it should be everyone. If you're in an Agile team, right, then your business analysts, your developers, your PO, your tester, your developer should all have a good understanding of what you're building and should be able to, maybe go through this application, see the structure of your application through its behavior, maybe through the folder structure. The idea is that not only creating language in a tool to make sure everyone understands it, but you want to branch this off, right? Maybe get some traceability between your other project management tools in your lifecycle. That's why HipTest can very easily link to any web-based tool through a badge or a linker. So you're going to link this to a GitHub, a Rally, a Confluence, so on and so forth. And even a proprietary web tool. Please feel free to do so. So you can have a nice one-click correspondence between that tool and your test cases in HipTest. More formally, we have a nice Jira integration, which is not only very slick, but it's just slick to set up as well. Give us your server cloud address, configure projects, and now, within a test run, within a scenario, within a folder of a scenario, I can go ahead and create a Jira issue. Anything available to me in that Jira story. Or within Jira itself, right, I could go ahead and drag or copy and paste HipTest scenarios right over to this section. And this is a nice integration and brings value to our users and customers in HipTest because not only are we linking the data together, but we can see a traceability between my test results, color-coded here, and my Jira scenarios, bugs, tasks, epic user stories, any scenario you're using, or any issue type in Jira you're using, sorry. We even give you a nice traceability matrix so that now, you can take this ability of this kind of effective collaboration and a shared business language in hip tests and now extend it to your other project lifecycle items. So a lot of you ask, okay, how do we follow BDD? Well, definitely one way is to collaborate, but you don't want to have to switch your entire process over, right? That's not going to be useful. A lot of you are probably using Jira, so continue to use Jira as you're using it. You're most likely using it effectively in an agile world, then have that value extended over to how you write test cases as well, right? A lot of times the tools only enable us to be agile, quote unquote, in certain parts of our process. Tool like hip test really allows us to kind of fill in those pieces so we can truly be continuous in our testing and delivery, as Akshita was talking about. Now, last piece here of the demo before I move on to test left is the code. And we'll talk about how the code we can get from hip test can be filled in with a tool like test left. And again, the whole idea is to bridge this agile story here. But very quickly, we've got a decent amount of questions, so I'm going to go ahead and answer them. Looks like both in the chat box and the Q&A box. Okay, so I'm going to have to let's start with the Q&A first. And I would recommend, I think, to also put your questions in the Q&A box. So Ed asks us, I assume you have to complete the step definitions before the steps become reusable. In code, yes, that is true. But right now, Ed, in hip tests themselves, a big part of BDD is you don't want to jump the gun necessarily. There's a concept that Matt Wine talks about. He's the founder of Cucumber. It's called example mapping. And I would look it up, actually. It's a very, very interesting and I think straightforward concept. It almost seems obvious, like you would do this, but I think a lot of us don't pay attention to it because you assume that, okay, we have 1 or 2 high-level examples of our feature, we're good to go. All right, let's go and build it. Let's go and test it. But really, the whole idea of example mapping, before you even get to the code, is to make sure that all scope of this feature, this behavior is being met, right? All possible corner cases, examples, uses, behaviors, right, are being discovered and talked about so that when you go and build it, you're not wasting your time having to refix something that wasn't properly scoped out. So use a tool like hip test, right, to scope everything out. The statements in these scenarios are reusable in their own right? So my BA could write this scenario. Maybe my tester developer comes in and says, hey, this scenario doesn't do a good job of explaining this behavior this way. Let's rewrite it. Then you can go ahead and maybe affect a shared step if you want to define it better, right, across your test cases. So think of the reusability, Ed, as just staying within hip test. But yes, when you define your step definitions, you get the same exact effect. Now, Mona asks us, is there a limited number of projects in hip test? No. Answer is no. Ed asks us again, can this integrate with Azure DevOps? If you could describe to us in a Q&A, Ed, what you would like that to look like, I could better answer that question. In terms of what you're trying to do. We don't have a built-in integration with Azure DevOps, but we could probably work with it depending on what you'd like to do. Okay.
We did also get a couple questions in the chat about what BDD is. So I do want to take a little bit of time before we dive in and expand this use case. BDD, for everyone on the phone, it's a software development process where teams can create simple steps on how an application should behave from a user's perspective. So as you can see from the demo that Param just did, he talked about a simple step that he's trying to complete in an orders application. How he expanded that simple step with the and keyword and what the outcome is. And the outcome really focuses on the user's perspective on an application should behave. This format of given, when, and then, that is a common language that people use to implement BDD, but is not a steadfast rule. You actually don't even have to write in Gherkin to implement and approach your development cycle with BDD in this format. You can actually just as simply write it in any way you want, as long as it really emphasizes that user perspective. Whereas traditional in non-BDD kind of approaches, it focuses on kind of the developer's point of view on how a software should behave. But by creating it on the user's perspective, by creating this shared understanding between the business analyst, the developer, and the tester, you're really able to create an application that is more aligned with across those stakeholders, as well as creating that perfect cross-section that we talked about. So I hope that answers some of the questions that people had about, broader question about what BDD is.
Yeah. And there's a couple questions in the Q&A, like, is BDD a way of writing unit tests for developers? Or is BDD way of writing unit tests useful for developers as well, or is it just useful for the way testers for writing functional tests? No, it is useful for developers as well. The whole point of BDD is to remove, if you remember that tweet that Akshita showed you, it's to remove uncertainty in your process. Now, if we're working more sequentially, my BAs might have a different idea of what the app should be behaving like than my developer, which might have a different idea than my tester, which might have a different idea than my DevOps guy, right? The whole idea is to remove that uncertainty by getting all your perspectives on the same page earlier.
Mhm.
So forget
I would
even
like to
gherkin, forget even
expand
this.
on that though, Param, because
What
like,
was that?
sorry, I wanted to expand on that piece
Sure.
because I agree that it is for developers as well. Because the whole point is to get some buy-in from all of these different stakeholders. However, when it comes to unit tests, I do find that and I'd love to get your perspective on this, but I do feel that the goal of unit tests is to really a ground-up approach, kind of still using that fundamental testing the functionality itself, like
Yeah.
testing that bit of functionality, but it doesn't, BDD is not a way of essentially writing the unit test. I think actually the two have separate goals.
Yeah. Like BDD will feed into TDD, right? Ultimately, you have to still write unit tests to test your code. It's just more about what those unit tests are, right?
Mhm.
If we're just simply defining tests for the sake of it, maybe have some scope, but the idea of BDD is to make sure that scope is really covering, again, what behavior your end user is expecting. The whole
Yeah.
idea of BDD being useful in this modern software world is that no longer building software just for the a specific role, right? We're building software for maybe an average end user, right? Someone with not technical experience, right? Someone who
Mhm.
expects your app to be intuitive. So in
Yeah.
order to do that, you have to
And I
gauge.
actually, sorry, go ahead.
Well, my final point is you just have to, really gauge what the expected behavior of your app is. And to do that effectively, as we've talked about, being iterative in your work, me following behavior-driven development process of, collaborating and making sure everyone in your team understands the scope of your project and what the
Yeah.
behavior your app is doing can help enable that process. That's
Mhm.
essentially what BDD is.
Yep, absolutely. And if developers are writing tests, and whether that's unit tests or functional tests, especially, I think that's a concept of that I always find intriguing is that the shift left movement, and BDD definitely helps the shift left movement, but the two are quite different.
All right. So there are a lot of other questions here that are getting to the next part of the demo. So I'm just going to move on.
Okay. Sounds
I think
great.
all your questions are going to be answered. So the last piece here is, yes, we need to go ahead and create step definitions for these. So those of you who have been doing BDD or been using a tool like Cucumber, each of these steps end up becoming a method in code, right? And we get that code with a simple export. And the idea with hip tests is that we can export to multiple different languages. So today we'll look at Java, but we can export to C#, Ruby, Python, JavaScript. We can export to certain frameworks in that. NUnit, JUnit, Groovy for Cucumber, QUnit, Behave, Behat. And you have a couple more coming out as well. The Hiptest team also their roadmap is also open source on Trello, along with on the tool. So you can always check out and make suggestions as to what you want to see from the tool or language supported in general. So the idea is that I can now take my test cases, the ones you define and redefine and refactored, with help of being collaborative, right? With our whole team involved, business users, analysts, testers, developers, etc. Now we have to go and build these test cases. So now here's the TDD part. So maybe we'll go ahead and click on JUnit, for example. I could export to Cucumber if I wanted to, right? And keep this complete within BDD. But if you think about it, HipTest is doing everything Cucumber would do. So I might not need the extra layer of abstraction in my work. You can simply just start with JUnit. So to Akshita's point, right, we can still take advantage of a unit testing framework. Nice thing you cannot do with open source BDD tooling. Or at least not do as easily, right? It's a little more manual setup on your end. But now we're going to get two files that you want to take a look at. First file is this project file. These are all my scenarios in my project defined in code, in this case, Java. So we can call our scenario adding an order, right? I get its Java equivalent here. I can see each step or action word defined in its own action words class. And if I parameterize my action words, they show up here. If I data drive my scenario, shows up as arguments, and then I can see their data-driven equivalents. Something I didn't cover, just for the sake of time, is you can and should data drive your test cases in a tool like HipTest. So I could take very quickly a scenario and data drive it, as you can see here with the variables and how they're being, how they're being called. And again, I wouldn't worry so much with the nitty gritty about this tool. I know some of your questions are, how might they be doing this, etc. Just for the sake of the webinar, I would think of this at a higher level for now. Because if you're interested in seeing a demo of this tool or knowing more information, check out HipTest's website. Contact us, through the academy or through your customer success manager. And we'll be happy to set up a demo or more informational session on how the tool actually works, right? But the whole idea here is that the tool allows us to follow this continuous delivery method, not only giving me nice refactorable scenarios, then giving me a way to translate that very easily into code as well, right? But now the key is you have to define these step definitions. So this file is done, but I have to define these action words. So that's the next piece of architecture that we get from HipTest, which is that action words class. But the key is that in HipTest, I can take a reusable step, and I can actually define it with smaller reusable steps. So the last feature, and we'll talk about how this extends to tests left in just a minute, the idea is that I can take this reusable step here, I have launch orders application, and define it with more reusable steps. Steps that could be, let's say, called by themselves in a scenario, or called in a definition of an action word, as you see right here. And you want to do this not only just for the sake of being modular and reusability, right? Because it's good design to always break up more complex steps, more complex problems into smaller ones, right? That's a good design principle. But the reason you really want to do that isn't just to get reuse in HipTest, but it's going to extend to your code. As an open source Cucumber, right, you would just get an empty method for I have launched orders application or SpecFlow or whatever it is. But with HipTest, when I define my method, right, with I have launched orders application with open browser and run URL, I now get that defined in my code. So really, use HipTest as a way to really set up and think about your design of your scenarios, right? Can you break up your scenario statement into smaller statements, right? Can you be more modular in your approach? Because the more you do that, not only will it be easier for you to refactor in HipTest itself, but then your code becomes more refactorable. Your code becomes easier to write, right? It's going to be quicker for me to define, opening a browser and running URL than me defining a much larger method, right? Because now my larger method's already been defined for me. It's calling these two helper functions. And so it's good code design, right? To just define helper functions and write those. It's quicker to write, quicker to unit test, right? So your short-term development is sped up. And then, your larger development pieces here of these larger test steps are also done for me, right? Because they've been broken apart already in HipTest. And then, I get a single point of maintenance for this as well, right? Where if I edit open browser, wherever scenario in my project is calling that gets edited, whatever scenario is calling my launch from application gets edited as well. So just good code design to be modular and build a lot of helper functions. We find that users cannot easily do that using a Selenium or using a Cucumber or SpecFlow, because the pieces they give you are very high level. So allow yourself to really be low level in HipTest, really flesh out your scenario and be modular, and you're going to get the same effect. So to kind of summarize here, the idea of HipTest in following BDD and being agile is to give you a more maintainable project structure, right? And giving that nice scenario editor for use my statements, give you a single point of maintenance for those statements. Then allow you to collaborate effectively, not only with the simple UI of the tool, but with our integrations with other tools in Jira. Then finally, right, this automated piece. We give you a more reusable and a more easily defined structure out the gate. The skeleton we give you versus open source BDD tooling is far, far, far easier to work with. So that when you automate this, whatever tool you'd like to use, automation becomes quicker and refactoring becomes quicker, right? Because with all this automated feedback, if we cannot refactor quickly, we might as well not have all that feedback. It'll be too much to work with. By giving you a structure, it's easier to refactor, how we can actually benefit from these nice principles that, agile testing talks about. We can actually, properly implement them. So now what I want to do is move on to tests left. It's great. You're saying, all right, awesome. We built the scenarios in HipTest. We're collaborating. We're working together. I'm getting more perspectives in my team, refactoring these scenarios, and the code structure we're getting is easier to work with. How to write this code? So you could use a Selenium, sure. But Selenium in itself, while free, definitely presents some challenges in being agile, right? It's hard to write good object-oriented code in Selenium, just given maybe, user time constraints, the nature of the code itself. It's hard to identify our objects reliably. A lot of hard-coded XPath calls has to be used, or calling CSS selectors. And then, right, when it comes time to refactor, if you're not building out object-oriented code in Selenium, refactoring becomes very, very difficult, right? You're going to have to edit a lot of your hard-coded references manually. And if you do spend time building out a page object model for your web or desktop app, that takes a lot of time in itself, right? You got to spend hours upon days building out a testing framework before even testing. So either way, these practices are not actually helping you speed up, right, in the long run or short run. So how does test left get around that? Well, test left simply is a test automation tool that you can use in any IDE you like. It supports Java and C#, and we can use the code we get from test left against your applications to fill out these methods. So that's kind of bridging the gap here, right? Use hip test to start off our process, right, and build our scenarios. Use test left to finish that process, build out our unit tests, and take advantage of the refactoring and code creation capabilities that tool has to offer. And then, and then later webinars we'll talk about launching from a Jenkins and managing that test data. But for now, let's move on to test left. So let me go ahead and open up my project, and we will go take a look at Java. Again, I do know that some of you were working at C#. We do support C# for this tool as well. FYI, we even support frameworks like NUnit, MS Test Unit, XUnit for C#. So I'm going to quickly answer a couple more questions while this loads up here. Let's see, we've answered. So Amine is asking us, is it easy to configure hip test to use a test framework for HIL testing? I definitely think so, because once you get that code from hip test, Amine, you can throw that code wherever you like, right? This code in front of you, you can do whatever you want with it. So you can totally create your own custom code framework or test framework around that. We talked about Java and hip test. Let's see here. Okay, IntelliJ is almost done loading. Let's see here. Since you've been paying this tool for a while, do you think there are limitations of it so far? I mean, limitations, it's hard for me to say. I haven't been using the tool for that long, Stefan. I think that something I know they're building out for the future is a much better Git integration. So right now, the Git integration is nice. We can link with a GitHub or a web-based, like a Bitbucket, right, and have a connection between your source code or your test code that you're storing in source control and your, scenarios and hip tests, your BDD scenarios. But in the future, they're going to improve upon that by allowing you to actually, I think, make changes to your source control tool from within hip test itself. All right. I think the rest of these are, how can we automate this? Okay, so we're going to get to that right now. Let's take a look at test left. So everyone should see my IntelliJ IDE, and we can see some of my scenarios here that I get from hip test, right? I can see my given when then. I can see some examples, and then that gets translated to my step definitions. So my step definitions are right over here, right? And you can see, for example, when I have, here, let me zoom in a little bit. There we go. Given I've logged in using username and password, it comes this method over here. So this is how generally BDD works. For those of you who don't know, when you write a scenario in an open source tool, in this case it was Cucumber, could be SpecFlow, could be Behat, each statement becomes its own step, right? And you saw the same thing with the hip test export, right? We saw that each scenario step becomes its own method. So now I have to define these methods, which I can do using test left. So I could use, again, Selenium, but it's going to kind of bog me down. But with test left, you can speed up a lot of this code creation process to help you to continue be agile as you like. So how do we get code like this? How do I get nice object-oriented lines of code that uses nice dot operators and references to, show me code that even maybe a non-technical user could read and can fairly understand, right? Well, that brings us to using test left to identify the objects on your application. So let's take a look at our sample application here. It's simply a web app. It's got 3 pages. And let's go ahead and view it on web browser. So for example, I might want to go ahead and log into my application, right? If I'm using, let's say, like, for example, the first step of our app, right, of our scenarios and hip test was, given I've launched the app and I've logged in. So let's say I'm in the logging in step, right? The second step of my scenario. And I want to go and log in. I'm using open source tooling, right? I would have to go ahead and inspect my element, find an ID or name, right? And go ahead and call it in a handwritten call, right, to Selenium, right, a find element by name or something like that. With hip tests, I don't need to do that. From my IDE, I can launch our handy UI Spy. At first glance, this UI Spy is simply an object tree. It's showing you everything running in Windows memory. If those of you have used Test Complete before, or any of you have that tool, it's the same exact object tree as Test Complete. Same functionality. And now, right, if I have my UI Spy, I can simply just find my object on the screen that I want to visibly recognize versus having to inspect it directly. And so, even if you're technical, if you're a developer, this is going to be easier for you than, inspecting the element yourself, right? Because I can visibly select control I want. It'll show up here in test left. And then I can right click that control and not only reference, maybe the methods or properties it has, but I can also generate it. I'll copy the identification. And then wherever I'm writing my test code, let's pretend we're in some test method right now, just for the sake of example. Control V or right click paste gives you my code. So what is this? This is simply what's called a pattern match to start from the highest level of my application and go to the object we're looking for. If you guys are using Test Complete, this is exactly what Test Complete does in the back end. And for those of you who do not, this is a proprietary to SmartBear. We're basically tracing the object path from its topmost parent to the object itself, because we can pull out all your data running in Windows memory. We're not relying on CSS layers, XPath. We're not relying on location. We can pull out everything in memory, making us a very powerful tool. So that first piece, right, how is test stuff useful in this scenario? Now you don't have to worry about shoddy object recognition. And we're definitely top of the line in this scenario here for both web and desktop applications, right? Everything that's publicly instantiated in code will show up here. And now I can quickly generate my code too, so I don't have to spend time and just identify my object, which is we see as a huge pain, right, in open source testing. But now I can just write, text box dot click or set text, whatever I need to do. I can get to my test actions far more rapidly with this method. But we're not just done with this, right? Sure, I can have these code pieces here, but part of creating a test framework that will be allow you to follow an agile workflow down the line is not only creating code quickly, but allowing you to refactor that code quickly. So right now, this is not very refactorable, right? If I'm calling this block of code every time I'm logging into my app, and I have to change how we call my text box, I have to make a bunch of hard-coded changes all over the place. I'm not trying to do that. I'd rather have a method I could call over and over again, right? But instead of throwing this into its own method by myself, I can have Tesla do that for me by creating a page object model from scratch. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and delete my stuff here. Let's go and open up the rest of my application. So we'll show you the whole part of my app, which is simply this login page, this view all orders page, and adding a new order. So I want to test this entire app. I'm going to throw this entire app up in memory here. I'm going to go spy on it, make sure I have the full app. I'm going to go to its parent process, right click it, and now I'm going to copy the model. And what this will do is generate an entire page object model. For those of you who don't know, a page object model is simply a series of classes and methods that represent your application in code. So you can reference the parts and controls in your application through nice object-oriented phrases. But, it takes a long time to write that from scratch. We've talked to a lot of teams out there who struggle in doing this. And when they, finally do it, the test code they write is definitely easier to read, easier to reuse, easier to write. But it took them so long just to get there that they're already late in their cycle. With tests left, I can easily generate my model. And wherever I'm defining class, wherever I'm at, wherever I'm at, let's take a look at this. And I can just go ahead and do a Control V. Boom. Kettle my code. Just like that. So what is this code? This code is a page object model that represents my entire web app, all 3 pages. Imagine writing this from scratch, right? This would take a long time to write from scratch. But not only is it done for me, it's properly indented for me, properly commented for me. All the identifiers are set up. And this is available for you in your IDE to edit. You want to edit what object references we use to find an element? Go ahead. You want to wildcard them? You want to change their value? You want to use a regex expression? Feel free to account for any dynamic objects you're working with. You can use the object spy, right, to pull out more up-to-date properties if you'd like. You even rename the methods, reorganize them. And that's what I ended up doing. I remade my app here, and I didn't spend that much time doing it. I think I spent like maybe 20 more minutes after that initial phase of generating it to change some class names and reorder. Didn't take that much time. And so now, instead of having a bunch of code generated to reference my text box to log in, I can just call this method, right? I can work with this much easier structure built out for me. This is another value test that brings. Not only are we speeding up code creation and giving you a much more robust way to recognize your controls in general, but now we're giving you a more maintainable test structure, because that's exactly what this model is doing. So now, talk about this in context of, let's say, like hip test, right? Hip test gave us, we built out our maintainable structure there in our scenarios, and we got some code for it. But you need to be able to create the code efficiently as well. So with test left now, you can generate a page object model of your app and use that to fill out those steps. So now when I define my steps from hip test, right, it's super easy with this object model. I define my model right here, the orders model, and something test left can do really well is for desktop apps, it won't matter obviously, but for web apps, it does not matter what browser you record your model in. The constructor class takes in any browser type. Super useful. So I can instantiate this model on any browser I'd like, in this case to do Firefox, and then use nice object-oriented coding to do my test steps. Right, so not only is the BDD aspect of this, right, the steps from hip test making this more readable, right, with the given, when, then steps, but the code itself is more readable, right? So you give this to another developer or tester, you can collaborate easily, right? Oh, I don't have to decipher this code that was written more, ad hoc, right? And then if I want to refactor, right, after I run my automated tests and get my feedback, I want to refactor, I'm not forced to refactor a bunch of hard-coded steps. Oh, okay, I want to change how we find our, we find the username box where I set text on it, go to model, go change it one time. Maybe the, identifier was dynamic. Let me go ahead and, wildcard that, right? One single point of maintenance for my code. So all that good stuff we're talking about in hip test of being modular and designing your scenarios, right? Test allows you to do the same thing, but on the other end, on the TDD end of this. And all this is setting up to do at the end of the day, as I close this demo out and hand it back to Akshita, is allowing you to build more maintainable test structure to be agile. At the end of the day, everyone wants to be agile, everyone talks about it, and they say, oh, we'll automate, we'll use Jira, we'll use this tool. Again, if it doesn't actually get you there, you're not really benefiting from the process. So to summarize, tools like hip test and test left, not only allow you to create scenarios more efficiently and reuse those scenarios, and then they allow you to collaborate and automate any language you like, but then in test left with Java and C#, you can not lose that value when it comes to actually write the code, right? You can still be modular with the page object model we create with our handy UI spy. We can make sure the object references themselves are robust enough so that we're not forced to, refactor or spend extra time identifying the objects. So we continue to be agile, we continue to be fast in our processes. And then all the same single point of maintenance value you get in hip tests, right? With these statements, you also now get with the code in those statements. So all of it's really feeds into itself, right? And the whole goal is build modular reusable pieces and build pieces that are readable. And so, if something is readable with your shared steps and the code, readability and reusability equals maintainability. And at the end of the day, right, that's what you're looking for as you deploy your code. Sure, you want to save some time in your sprints, but you also want to be able to, save time in your regression testing or save time in, future development of new features. In order to do that, you want to make sure your current structure is sound in this environment. So that's my demo of hip test and test left. Obviously, it's not going to be the full product demos just because of the sake of the webinar's timing, but hope that this was helpful in you guys seeing how SmartBear are going to play in this agile field and really building, bringing some concreteness, right? Some groundedness to these approaches that can very much be high level to an organization, right? And if you have any questions about these tools, do reach out to us. So now what I want to do is definitely answer some questions before we end out this call here today. Do appreciate all the enthusiasm. So let's see. David asks us, every time a feature changes, do you think it is best to create a new bunch of tests to modify the ones we already have? Not necessarily, David. So the idea of building out reusable tests and hip tests is that maybe your feature changes, right? You want to analyze your hip test scenario on that feature. Hey, are all parts needing to be changed or only some parts? And you realize that maybe only half your test needs to change. You don't have to write a new scenario, just change those reusable parts. Maybe those reusable parts, David, are used in other scenarios. So you get that same effect, right, of making bulk changes all from a single place. So
Also, as we're addressing some of the questions, I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll. We'll take a few more minutes to, I'll let Param answer some additional questions, but in the meantime, please go ahead and submit the poll when you get a chance. Go ahead, Param.
awesome, not a problem. So any plans to hip test, integrate hip test with test complete? So Alexi, hip test only integrates with test left. Integrate, I mean, not really. You wouldn't need to integrate it, right? Because test left lives in an IDE environment. So the idea is that I would just post, like I would get these steps, these empty methods from hip test in my IDE, and I fill it up with test left. So they're only integrated in like a workflow sense, but you would need to integrate them from tools. We are coming out with a hip test complete integration. That will be coming out in the new year. We're very excited about that. So do keep an eye out for that. Is there a planned support for Cypress? I'm not sure, Peter, but you could actually message the hip test staff in a Drift right here if you're interested in learning more about if that's supported, or check their roadmap, which you can Google or go through the trial. Okay, Prasanna asks us, if my application goes through redesign, should I change my test scenarios and framework as well? Does not seem to be a lot of rework in both areas. Well, so it depends, right? So the idea of Prasanna is BDD is not something that you can just attach to your current process and say, okay, this is going to help us. It definitely is challenging how you build software to begin with, right? Again, the beginning is very important here, that initial phase. So if you have been following behavior-driven development and collaborating and building in an iterative fashion, in a collaborative fashion, so everyone knows what's happening in the beginning of your application development, when you redesign, most likely you have parts that can be changed, which will affect the rest of your application. So you don't have to go ahead and redefine everything from scratch, right? Most likely, if you do auto redesign as well, you might have considered, that to be the case beforehand as well. So it's hard for me to say without really looking at your app, but it depends, I'd say, on how much work you put in the beginning of your development, right? If you don't put a lot of thought into, how many examples or how many corner cases your behavior will have, you start developing it, then yeah, it's going to be a little more of a drawn out process when it comes time to refactor. But if you consider it more in the beginning, the amount of refactoring you have to do will always decrease. Alexia asked us, does test always support pattern code generation that uses custom attributes to reliably identify web elements? Yes. So we recognize we actually added new support for Angular and Node.js, but we'll try to pull out the most unique identifiers in your control. So in your local system here, right, you'll have a bunch of controls over here that we can pull out from, unique or non-unique. Tesla's pretty good about finding controls with the most unique identifiers we can find, but if it's not satisfactory for you, again, the model we give you is for you to go ahead and edit. You can go ahead and add extra identifiers or wildcard, do what you got to do. But I think what we give you out the gate is very, very robust in its own right. Let's see here. Does Tesla write the methods for you? No, it's not a record and replay tool, Vicky. You have to write out the code, but it gives you the code pieces to use out the box, right? I can quickly generate code by right-clicking any object in this tree and generating a identification for it. Let's see. Can we automate Windows-based applications using hip test? So Simi, the large answer is yes. Short answer is no, because hip test is not an automation tool. Hip test is a process tool, if you think about it. Use test left to automate your Windows application, which can be managed by hip test. Excuse me. I got a bit of a cough this morning. All right. Let's see. Yep, we do support React apps. Can we automate a desktop application the same way as a web app? Yes, you can, anonymous attendee. Great question. On all SmartBear tooling supports automation and testing on web and desktop apps, not mobile. How to automate frequently using changing data, like trading data using hip test. In hip test, you want to go ahead and create. So here's another thing. You want to speed up your automation. I'm sure you guys are all automating against data sets. But instead of adding data set to your automation directly, add it first here in hip test, right? Data drive your scenarios as much as you can with an Excel data table or a Gherkin data table. So then your data-driven tests are already defined for you when you have to define it in code. So then it's going to be quicker setup for you. You don't have to attach data sets to your code. It's done for you. Just define your steps. So that's how I would do that, anonymous attendee. Use data sets in hip test. Finally, Rob Savage here, last question. Does TestUp require plugins or libraries to be added, or is it simply copy and paste? You need a TestUp license, and that's it. Currently, it is copy and paste in terms of the code. You don't have to install anything other than TestUp itself. But wherever you're defining your TestUp code, make sure you have our libraries as well. So the only requirement is a license and a libraries in your class file or test file, and that's it. All right, so it looks like we were able to get through a lot of this. And again, we'd love any feedback as well. If you didn't think if you want, know more information about the webinar, if you think that we're too high or low level, whatever it is, we'd love any feedback about this so we can make sure to give you guys, the best content we can. We do thank you for attending today. And since a lot of you want to learn more, do reach out to your customer success manager, reach out to a SmartBear rep, right? Reach out to marketing, reach out to, I think, whoever sends you the recording, you reach out to them. We'd be happy to get back in contact with you.
Yes, and we also know that you had some questions about just in general, what's BDD, what's shift left, etc. There are plenty other webinars, recordings as well that's provided on smartbear.com/resources/webinars, as well as ebooks on various topics. So I hope those are useful to you. Thank you again. We know you have limited time in your day and appreciate you joining us today. Hope to see you again next time. Take care, everybody.
Have a wonderful day.